Advanced Seminar in U.S. Foreign Policy, America in a Multipolar World, Week 4. Post-American and Post-Western. For the next few minutes, let's make a concerted effort not to talk about Europe. This is something that became a very large point of contention, especially during the administration of Barack Obama, when there was the pivot to Asia, which included moving an aircraft carrier from the Atlantic Fleet in Norfolk, Virginia, to the Pacific Fleet over on the West Coast. Since the end of the Cold War, and developing and gaining traction since then, has been this overwhelming, I guess you could say, push within foreign policy and political science for the United States to start concentrating less on Europe and more elsewhere. Not necessarily any other specific place, but simply elsewhere. Now, the logic for this isn't completely unfounded. There are very strong arguments you can make. The Soviet Union is gone. The Soviet threat is gone. Much of this, of course, came about, of this talk came about before the rise of Vladimir Putin. However, some of it still persists because, as we spoke about last time, the only other superpower state in existence right this second is China. So again, for the next few minutes, let's just simply act like Europe doesn't exist. We're not going to talk about Europe. Now, we talked about power last time. We discussed powerful states. And this, for the next few minutes, we're going to endeavor to answer more thoroughly the question, are there non-Western powers in the world today? Of course, we have already talked about China. China definitely has the mass. They do have the force. Yet their economics are somewhat questionable. They are very, very dependent on global trade. This is one of the large counter-arguments to the argument of China being the largest threat as far as conventional military, because if China were to start a war with the West, a war with the United States, what would happen to their economy? What would happen to all that stuff that we buy? Largely put, this is seen as a victory for Bill Clinton's globalization and the liberal concept of interconnectedness. The Chinese are in the World Trade Organization, and what liberal international relations theorists say interconnectivity can provide, which is a closeness, a business relationship that can lead to peace. China is probably the best example of that so far. So yes, they are a power, but as I wrote in my notes, you might want to put a check or a star next to them because their economics are limited to that extent. We have Japan. Again, last time we talked about them. They're a hard no. They have very limited mass. They're an island. Their economic policy domestically has been dominated by bailouts for the last couple decades, and they have no real force. They have a defense force. Now, I mentioned China again today because we have to be very, very of Japanese security concerns. There's one piece that I saw written that said the only people who want us in Japan more than the Japanese are the Chinese, because as of right now, our proximity of our American forces in the region keep Japan from changing their constitution, creating a modern army, and starting an arms race in the region that could be dangerous for everybody. The next state I want to look at is India. Now, India is a very neglected topic in American foreign policy. This is for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, most of their efforts militarily are directed against one state, and that's Pakistan. They have had wars with China in the past. These were brief. But looking at them as a power, they definitely have the mass. They have over 1 million people. They do have the 5th largest army in the world, as well as nuclear weapons. The problem with India is their economy, and that's because it's developing. Now, it looks like a problem when we look at it from terms of force, but it's definitely a positive because it's developing. It's growing at a rate of 7% annually. Yet, again, we have to understand where they're at economically and financially. Their per capita income is less than $2,000 a person, and only about 10% of the entire country is has the internet. Less than 30, I believe it was about 70% of people have functioning toilets. They have large infrastructure needs, and economic inequality is an issue for them. Now, aside from these specific states, there are prospective powers that are hobbled by what we call regional constraints. Africa, most of the countries don't have the economic capabilities or military assets. If you look back at the history of Africa, if you notice, many of these borders look like they were drawn by a ruler, meaning, like you would use in geometry. That's because it was. A lot of the borders in Africa remained from after the warring period, World War I and World War II, when Europe essentially enforced a map on them. Now, you will probably see over the next decades more civil wars, more regional conflicts there. That's because you have a group of nations who are trying to determine their map. Okay, a lot of these borders were imposed and cut right down the middle of language groups, ethnic groups, religious groups. So while there is some economic capability in oil, they're just simply not there yet. They're still developing. The Middle East, they're so economically dependent on oil, you really can't rely on them. There are military powers. Of course, Iran is working on nuclear weapons. Israel has nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia spends, I believe it's close to 10% of their GDP on military weapons. I believe the last time I saw it was 8%. That's the highest in the world. But they are, again, so dependent on oil that if something were to happen to the international market, the entire region might be thrown into disarray. So as superpowers, you really can't regard them as such. There's South America, which is, they have very, very large issues with economics. There are some of the smaller countries that are somewhat successful, but they're just that. They're smaller countries. And also you have to remember a lot of South America is sparsely populated. Not many people living in the Amazon. Some of the regions are rather mountainous. While they can be players on the international stage, they really can't be considered superpowers. And finally, Russia, who we talked about last time. And just to reiterate, they do have some major issues. One point I want to make, though, is there is a consistent ongoing debate, on whether or not Russia is European or Russia is Asian. And there's camps on both sides that will make the arguments. To clear this up, it could be best summarized as Russia is Russia. They're not like any other country that you're going to see. Having said that, they are limited by the fact they only have 142 million people in this big country. They're very dependent on oil, as we spoke about before. They do have a large and growing military with nuclear capabilities. If there are any questions about this period in U.S. and foreign policy or anything else, feel free to contact me.